What's going on, everybody? Thanks for tuning back in. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to use JSON Web Tokens as your authentication of choice for a RESTful API. For our RESTful API base, we're going to be using NodeJS, Typescript, and Express, and we're going to be storing our username and password into either a MongoDB or a MySQL database. This video is actually going to be split into two videos. The first half of each video is going to be the same, where I set up the common functions between both MySQL and Mongoose, and then the second half of the video is going to be specific for MySQL or Mongoose, respectively. If you do not have a RESTful API to begin with, I do have a GitHub repository that does have this project set up as a base for you, so I will leave those links below in the description, and you could follow along with the code, or you could start with your own. It should be very easy to actually integrate whatever I'm doing into your API if you have it set up in a similar way. Okay guys, let's get into it. So to get started, let's run an npm install bcrypt.js and JSON Web Token. And after we do that, we're going to do the same thing with the type definitions by doing an npm install --save dev and then the types for each, as you'll see in a moment. What these libraries do is JSON Web Token has all of the built-in functions we need to create a token for each specific user, and bcrypt.js is going to help us encrypt our password before we put it in the database. It's important that we don't store your password as plain text in the database for security reasons. The next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to be renaming some files that I have from my API setup from that GitHub repository I told you about before, and I'm going to create some folders. I'm going to create a functions folder, a middleware folder, and I'm also going to be creating an interfaces folder. I'm going to rename my routes sample TS to my user TS. I'm going to do the same thing for my controller. Inside my server file, I'm going to rename this to my user routes and then change my user routes down below, as well as my API path. Again, the reason that I'm doing all this is because I'm using a previously set up tutorial GitHub repository that I made before. So again, if you're following along with your own project, you don't have to take these steps. I'm going to go inside my controller function and I'm going to rename this first function to validate token. I'm just going to get rid of everything on the inside here, and I'm going to copy this 4 times because I'm going to need 4 different routes for this specific tutorial. The 4 routes that I'm going to need are validate token. I'm going to need a register route. I'm going to need a login route, and I'm going to need a get all users route. I'm also at the top of the file going to throw in a constant namespace so I can keep track of my logging and where my logging comes from. So to briefly explain what we're going to need these functions for, validate token is going to be a protected route that we're going to use for testing to make sure that the token we assign ourselves in our login function is working properly and the user is authenticated properly. The register route is going to be for creating a new user and storing them in the database. The login route is going to log in the user and return that token and maybe the user object as well. And then the get all users is just the standard extra function that I'm going to throw in where it is just going to return each user in the database and not show their passwords. So let's start by filling out each of the functions and files that we can before we have to pick our MySQL or Mongo database. Let's start off in the validate token by adding a little logging statement here. My logging library uses a namespace. That's why I'm having this constant at the top. I'm going to pass in my namespace, and I'm going to pass in a message that says token validated, user authorized. You could put really anything you want here. And then I'm going to return a response with the status of 200 with a JSON message on the inside that simply says the user is authorized. At the bottom in the export default statement, I'm going to go ahead and pass in my 4 functions. You don't have to name them, as when you just put in the name, JavaScript understands that you're passing in both the key and the value as the exact same thing. Inside the register function, I'm going to go ahead and put a let brackets equal to my request.body. And on the inside, I'm going to pass in a username and password. At the top of the file, I'm going to import bcrypt.js from bcrypt.js. And then back inside my register file, I'm going to actually run the bcrypt.js.hash function. Inside of it, I'm going to be passing in a couple things here. First, I'm going to pass in the password, which is the password coming from our request.body, so it's not encrypted yet. Then I'm going to pass in a number that it needs for the length of the salt. And the last but not least, I'm going to pass in a callback function with an error and a hash. So as far as how bcrypt.js actually works, I suggest you read the documentation, as I'm not an expert on salting and hashing, but I do know how to use the library to encrypt my passwords. Inside of the bcrypt hash function, first I'm going to check to see if there is an error. So I'm going to check to see if there is a hash error, and if so, I'm going to return a response.status of 500. I'm going to send back some JSON with both the message and the error. So the message I can get from the hash error.message, and the error is going to be from my hash error itself. And then after that if statement, I'm just going to put in a little comment here that says insert user into DB. So depending on if we're using Mongo or MySQL here, this is where we're going to actually insert the user. Next, I'm going to go to my routes, and first I'm going to enter my validate route and attach it to the appropriate controller validate token. I'm going to copy and paste this 4 times. And then I'm just going to rename my routes for each of my functions. So I'm going to have a register, a login, and a get /all for get all users. I'm going to change the 2 in the middle, register and login, to post requests because I'm going to be passing in information. And then after I'm done this, I'm going to change each of the controller's functions to the appropriate one. So register, login, and get all users. Once I'm done all this, I'm going to create a new interface. So this is how I'm going to keep track of my data type and what's supposed to be on my data type when I'm grabbing it from the database or inserting it in the database. So we're going to create a new interface called user.ts. On the inside, we're going to do an export default interface iUser. And on the inside, we're going to have 2 keys, a username and password with the values of string correspondingly. Nice and simple. In our middleware, let's go ahead and create an extract JWT.ts function. So this is the first function we're actually going to take a look at working with tokens. So to explain how the tokens work, basically what happens is you request a token from the server and the server signs it for you. Now, every time you make a request to a protected route in the server, you're going to have to pass along that token inside your authorization header on your post request, which I'm going to show you how to do later in Postmon. What this middleware is going to be doing, it's actually going to be taking out that token and checking to see if it's valid. So if this function determines that, yes, your token is valid, it will proceed and let you to the root. Otherwise, you're going to get a 401 unauthorized error. So we're going to go ahead and import some brackets from Express. And inside of that, we're going to be returning its request, response, and next function interfaces appropriately. And I'm actually going to just go ahead and I'm just going to copy one of my functions from my controller because it already has it kind of set up for me. And I'm going to paste it in this file. I'm just going to close the function off. And instead of validate token, I'm going to rename this to extract JWT because it's going to work much like those functions do. Except in this one, we're actually going to be using the next to pass along to the next function inside of the request. I'm going to put a little logging statement in here, just saying validating token. Now to extract the token from my headers, I'm going to check my headers for my request from the authorization. And what I'm doing is I'm actually splitting the array by the space and grabbing the second part. When you pass in your token, you're going to be passing in what's called a bearer token. So it's literally going to have the word bearer in front with a space and then the token. The reason that we're doing this is because this is one of the standards that a lot of APIs use, and it's good coding practice. So let's go ahead and check if there is a token. Inside of this is where we're going to be actually using our JWT functions. So let's import JWT from JSON Web Token. And inside of our config, before we do anything else, I have to add a couple things here. We have to add an issuer, the expire time, and a secret that's going to actually encrypt the token. So inside of my config file, I'm going to go ahead and make 3 new variables like you see here, and I'm going to call them server underscore token underscore expire time. I'm going to do server underscore token underscore issuer, and I'm going to be doing a server underscore token underscore secret. And again, the secret is for actually encrypting and decrypting your JWT. The issuer, you can basically just use this as your organization name. This is just a little bit extra to put inside the token. And then the expire time is the expire time in seconds. Once we've created our 3 variables, let's go ahead and put that into our server object just below it. And then everything inside the config file is all gravy. So now, if we go back to our extract JWT function, let's go ahead and call JWT.verify. And inside of it, we're going to pass in the token. We're going to pass in our config.server.token.secret. And config should automatically import for you with Visual Studio Code if you don't have it already. And then a callback with error and decoded. So if there is an error, you have a few options here. You can return a 401 unauthorized, or you can return something else like a 404 or a 500. The reason that you would do this is because maybe you have a very, very secure API and you don't actually want end users knowing why their token didn't work. In that case, you could use a 404 or a 500 if you want to be extra sneaky about it. So let's go ahead and just return a response.status of 404. Much like we do in the catch error blocks of the other functions, and just pass in our message, error.message, and our error object. Once we get past this, we can go ahead and just put else, and we can actually pass along our decoded to our endpoint. And how we can do that is by using the response.locals. Response.locals is a clever way to go ahead and save variables and pass them along to the functions or middleware that are going to be using this payload next. So after I add my JWT decoded, I can go ahead and just call the next function right after it. So what it's going to do is going to save my token decoded, and it's going to go ahead and pass that along. At the bottom, we can just put an else, and here if you want, you can return a 401 unauthorized. At the bottom, we can go ahead and export default extract JWT. Now we can go ahead and create a new function called sign JWT. So when our user logs in, we're going to be calling this sign JWT that's actually going to create the token and return it to them so that they can use it to try and access any of our protected routes with that extract JWT function. At the top, we're going to import JWT from JSON Web Token. We're going to import our config from our config file. We're going to import our logging from our logging file. And we're going to import our iUser from our interfaces user. We're going to add our namespace of auth. And we're going to create our sign JWT function. Now, this function is going to have two parameters, a user of type iUser and a callback. Inside the callback, we're going to have an error that's either equal to an error or null. Or it's going to have our token, which is going to be a string or null. So inside of this, we're going to need to start off with three variables. Our first variable is going to be our time since epoch, which is going to be new date.getTime. This is going to return the time in milliseconds since I think it's like January 1st, 1970. This is like the basic millisecond date for all of your date objects. So next, actually, we're going to be doing our expire time, which is going to be our time since epoch plus the number that we have in our config, which is actually the time in minutes, not seconds. And we're going to be multiplying that by 100,000 to get the time in milliseconds. Then we're going to be creating another var, our expiration time in seconds. And how we get that is using a math.floor and then dividing your expire time by 1,000. After that, we're going to be adding some logging. So I'm just going to say attempting to sign the token for user.username here. And then we're going to be adding a try catch block. Inside of it, we're going to be doing a JWT.sign. Now, this takes in a couple parameters. The first object that it takes in is your payload. So you can pass in, for example, a username the user role, like if they're an admin or not, or any other vital information you may want to be using the token for. I'm just going to pass in the username and make that equal to my user.username. The second thing we pass in is our config.server.token.secret. And then the third part, we're going to pass in some options. We're going to pass the issuer from our config.server.token.issuer. As far as algorithm goes, I'm just going to be using the standard HS256. Again, if you want to learn about all the different encrypting algorithms, you can go ahead and read the JSON Web Token documentation. And then expires in, I'm going to pass in my expire time in seconds. The JWT.sign function also has a callback. So we're going to be calling back our error and our token. So if there is an error, we're going to pass in our callback, make our error equal to error and our token equal to null. So when we call this from another function, that's how we know it's not going to be working properly if we get the error. Vice versa, else if token, we're going to be passing in a callback with our error equal to null and passing in our token. So inside the function using the callback, they'll know that the token was returned properly. And last but not least, in the catch block, you can go ahead and throw in a logging message there to catch your error. And also you can put the callback here, pass in the error and null as well. That way, if there is a problem even signing the token, you will get the error here. So this is all we need to do to set up everything that's common between whatever database that you're using. So this is the point in the video where we're actually going to diverge into whichever specific database this video is about. So now that we have our basic JSON Web Token set up, we need to save our users into a database in order to authenticate them. We're going to be using MongoDB for this video. So I already have a base project that I'm going to be copying and pasting some MongoDB values over for myself. But if you already have MongoDB hooked up in your RESTful API, you can go ahead and skip the initial setup and get to the part where we actually go through the routes and set up the functions. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to paste in this Mongo options object. Generally, this is the same for most Mongo connections if you're using the most recent version. And then I'm going to create a few Mongo variables, and those are username, password, and host to go along with the options. I'm going to go ahead and just put in the values I'm using for my dummy database that I've uploaded. You guys can go ahead and just connect it to yours. Once you've actually created these three variables, then like we do for the server, we have to make an object to hold all of the Mongo options. So that's just going to be a const Mongo and then host, password, and username. But also you're going to have a URL, and that's going to be the actual link that goes to Mongo. So it's going to be usually MongoDB with a colon and 2 forward slashes, or MongoDB plus serve, and then the same thing. Once you've created that object, you can go ahead and put it in your const config in the bottom and just call it Mongo. Once we do that, let's go ahead and install our packages that we need. So we're going to run an npm install Mongoose. And after that's done installing, you're going to run an npm install save dev and then the types for Mongoose. Once you've installed the types for Mongoose, you can go ahead and go back to your server file, and you can go ahead and import Mongoose from Mongoose. And then we're going to make a section that connects to Mongo. So we're going to run a mongoose.connect, and we're going to pass in our config.mongo.url. And actually, we should go back to the config file because I forgot to pass in the options here. So just put the options with the Mongo options in the config object. Then go back and make that your second argument. And then you can add a try-catch block here if you want. You don't actually need this part, but I like to do it just to log what's going on to see if I connect to the MongoDB or not. So inside the then block, just a little logging info saying MongoDB connected, and in the error block, a similar error message. And then very quickly, I'm going to go ahead and just run a ts node dev here. That's the npm library I'm using to actually test my code. And I'm just going to see if I get the Mongo connected message. And I do. It looks like everything's running properly. So let's go ahead and move on. There's a few alterations we have to do to some of the existing code we made in the common part between Mongo and MySQL. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to our interface file. We're going to extend the iUser by adding the document interface, and we're going to go ahead and import that document from Mongoose at the top of the file like so. Now that we've done that, we're going to go ahead and create a models folder. And inside of that models folder, we're going to create our user model. So we're going to do that by creating a user.ts file. Inside of it, from the top, we're going to import our Mongoose, and we're going to be importing our schema from Mongoose. And then we're going to actually import the interface iUser from the interfaces file we just modified. Next, we're going to create a const user schema, and that's going to be a type schema, and we're going to make that equal to a new schema. And in the first object, or the first option, we're going to be adding the variable, so that's going to be a username, and we're going to attach to it a type string and our required true. I'm assuming that you already know how to use Mongoose somewhat, and we're going to just copy and paste that and make our second thing equal to password. And we're going to add a singular option for timestamps to be equal to true. And that's just because I like putting timestamps in the database. Next, we're going to export default a mongoose.model. In the chevrons, we're going to pass in our iUser interface. We're going to call the schema user and pass in our user schema. Now that we have everything we need to actually connect to the MongoDB, we're going to go back to the user controller and we're going to start editing our functions. At the top, we're going to go ahead and import Mongoose from Mongoose. We're going to import our user from our model that we just created, so from our models user file. And we're going to import the signJWT function we created in our setup from our function signJWT. Now let's go back to that bcrypt.js hash that we created and actually save our user. So we're going to make a constant user equal to a new user. Inside, we're going to give it a new Mongo ID by calling a new mongoose.types.objectID as a function. We're going to pass in our username, and for our password, we're going to pass in the hash because we want to save the encrypted password into our database, not the plain text. Once we do that, we're going to return our underscore user.save, and we're going to add a then and catch block. For the then block, we're going to pass in our user props to a function, and we're going to go ahead and return a status of 201, which means created. And inside the JSON, we're going to maybe add a little message that says user created, or just pass in the user by itself. It's totally up to you. Inside the catch block, we're going to add a return response status of 500, and we're just going to pass in the message, error.message, and the error object. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to, again, define our request body with our username and password, like you see here. And then we're going to do a user.find, and we're going to pass in the username. That's how we're going to search MongoDB for our user. We're going to execute it, and then we're going to add a then block and a catch block as we usually do. When we're using users.find, this is actually going to return us an array of users. So we want to make sure we only find one user of this username. And we're going to make sure that if the length is not equal to 1, return a 401 because we're running into issues here. A better way to do this is to make sure that when you create a new user, for the value to be unique, so this situation will never happen. Once you do that, we can call bcrypt.js.compare, and we can compare the password that's being passed in with our user's password that's being returned to us. So the unencrypted password is going to get compared to the encrypted password, and it's going to return a callback with error and result appropriately. In here, like we've been doing for a lot of our other functions, you're going to check to see if there is an error. If so, that means we know there was a password mismatch. So here you can return a 401, a 404, something like that. I'm just going to copy the status from above. If there isn't an error though, you're going to want to pass in the result. But before you do that, maybe if you want to see what's going on, you can go ahead and log this error here. It's just good practice. So once we check for our else if result, we know that the user is logged in. We want to return a few things here. Since the user is logged in, we're going to actually want to return a token to the user because the token is what they're going to be using to authenticate with any of our protected routes. More specifically, the validate token route that we created earlier that's going to need to extract the JWT when you call that route. So how we're going to do this is we're going to call the function signJWT that we created earlier. We're going to pass in our user, and then we're going to get our callback, which we created when we made that function. We're going to check to see if there is an error. And much like we've been doing before, you can probably just copy and paste that in here. And you could pass in the error block if you want to here. Totally up to you guys, depending how secure you want your API. I'm just going to throw in the message here, unable to sign token, and then pass in the error. And if everything is A-OK and you get your token returned, go ahead and return a response.status of 200. And you could pass in some JSON here. Pass in a message maybe that says auth successful, pass in the token, and pass in the user. That way, when you log in, you returned all the necessary information your front end may need. After all of this, you can go ahead and put a catch block on that user.find and just copy and paste the code that we had in here before. So now we've created functions for validating, creating the user, and logging the user in. Let's go ahead and just create a getAllUsers function so we can actually see all the users in our database. You're going to type user.find, but then you're going to add a select block and put in quotes -password so that when you're returning all the users, you don't actually want to return all the passwords. That information is useless in a call like this. And it's actually bad practice and bad for security if you're returning it every time somebody calls this route. You only ever want to return the password when it's absolutely necessary. Inside of the users array that's returned, go ahead and just pass that into a response.status of 200 and maybe put in an extra variable like count that returns your users.length. I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste the catch block from above as I've always do. It's always easy to reuse code like this. And then the last thing we're going to do before we test is we're going to import our extract JWT from our middleware inside of our routes file. And we're going to put that extract JWT middleware in front of our controller.validate token. That way, the only way to get to that final function in our controller file is they have to get through the extract JWT function first. And you'll see when we call this route what happens if you call it with and without the token. So I'm going to go ahead and call our ts node-dev and call my server file again, start it up, see that Mongo connects, and then I'm going to bring in my postmon utility. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be calling our localhost and I'm going to call our users get all route. So what happens when I call that? It returns a list of empty users because we actually haven't created one yet. Let's go ahead and actually create a user with a post request. And we're going to put in our localhost, but users, and we're going to put in register. We're going to pass in a body, and inside of that body, we're going to have a username and password key. And we're going to be doing this with our raw JSON format. For the username, let's just put, as we always do, I don't know, Bob, and then something rudimentary for the password. We could just put like hello123 or something. This is just for testing, obviously. I hope your passwords in real life are more secure than this. If you hit create, you can go ahead and see that the user was created, the timestamps were added, and the password was hashed inside the database. So if we go back and call our users get all function, you see the users are all returned that are in the database without the passwords. So this is pretty secure. And then finally, we can actually change this route to the login route, and it should return us a token with our user. So it's going to do that. And you can see that the token is returned here along with our user object. Now, what you can actually do is delete the password off this object too before you return it. That's probably a good idea because again, you're not going to be needing the password in its hash format to actually be returned to the user. Finally, the last thing we can do is we can copy this token and we can make a request to our validate route. So I'm going to copy that get all route, change that to validate. And if I try to go to the validate route without inputting the token, you're going to see that it returns the message unauthorized. So let's go ahead and add an authorization header. And inside the value, type in bearer with a capital B, space, and then paste the token, and then try and call the endpoint again. And then you're going to get a message that says authorized. And if you check the console text after, you can see that the request actually did go through with the status of 200. So again, what's happening here is when you try and call a protected route that you're unauthorized to look at without a token, it's just going to kick you out saying you're unauthorized. But if you do pass the token in the proper way, like we did here, you'll have access to those routes. Now, inside of that token payload, where I only put the username, you could probably put some sort of role-based authentication. You could put if the user's an admin or not. You can put extra information in there if you want routes to be more than just protected for users, but also protected for certain elevations of users too. That's probably a good place to put it. Okay guys, so there you have it. So in the first half of this video, you saw how to set up some of the functions, and in the second half, you saw how to connect this to a MongoDB. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you want, check out the MySQL version of this video as well. Okay guys, thanks so much for tuning back in.